That night with my son Lucas remains, without a doubt, the most chaotic and yet strangely thrilling night I've ever lived through. My name is Michael, and I feel it's time to share something deeply personal, something that unfolded between me and my son, Lucas. It's hard to talk about, but I've carried this silently for far too long. Lucas is 19 now, but this all began a few years back, right after my wife, Barbara, passed away. Losing Barbara was one of the greatest losses of my life, and it left Lucas and me to figure out how to go on without her. In the beginning, it was rough. Lucas kept to himself, barely speaking, spending hours locked away or out with friends. He avoided any mention of Barbara or what had happened, and I didn't want to force him. Instead, I focused on creating a warm and safe space for us both. I'd cook his favorite dishes, leave little notes of encouragement on his desk, and do my best to show him I was there whenever he was ready. But for a long while, he stayed distant. Then, one night, he walked into the kitchen while I was tidying up after dinner. His sudden arrival startled me, but I was glad to see him. He rarely sought me out. "Need help, Dad?" he asked softly. I looked at him, surprised. "Sure, you can dry the dishes," I replied, handing him a towel. We worked side by side. In silence, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a tiny sense of peace. It was the first moment he'd willingly spent with me in what felt like forever. "How was school today?" I asked, breaking the quiet. "It was fine." He mumbled, eyes down. That was all. I didn't push. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here," I said gently, watching him from the corner of my eye. He gave a quick nod, saying nothing more. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small changes. Lucas started hanging around more, sitting with me, while I watched TV or helping with chores. Slowly, he opened up, talking about classes and college plans. I began to feel hopeful, like we were finally returning to some version of normal. But one evening shifted everything. We were eating dinner together. Lucas had cooked a basic pasta he'd learned from a friend. As we ate, he looked up and said, "You're amazing, Dad." I chuckled, brushing it off. "Thanks, Lucas. That means a lot," I replied casually, but his expression remained serious, eyes locked on mine in a way that made my stomach flutter. "What's wrong?" I asked cautiously. "Nothing," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I just wanted to say thanks for everything." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The moment felt odd, but maybe he was just being thoughtful. The crazy night hadn't happened yet, but that dinner marked the beginning. After that, Lucas's behavior changed. He began hovering near me, sitting close on the couch or lingering in the kitchen. At first, I thought it was endearing, just a son trying to reconnect. We had both grieved alone for so long, but then came the stares. His eyes would linger, a bit too long, and the compliments grew more personal. "You look really nice today, Dad," he said one morning as I stood washing dishes. "Thanks, sweetheart," I replied, keeping my voice light, but the way he said it, the way he looked at me, left me uneasy. One night we sat watching a movie he picked, a comedy we'd seen a dozen times. Halfway through, I realized he was sitting unusually close. Our shoulders touched, and when I shifted slightly, he didn't move. "You're always so busy," he said out of nowhere. "You never take time for yourself." I smiled, caught off guard. "That's what dads do, Lucas. There's always something." He shook his head, eyes steady. "You do too much. You need a break." His words tightened something in my chest. "That's sweet of you," I said softly, "but I'm okay. Really." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring up, replaying the moment again and again. Was it just kindness? Or was I reading into something more? What was really happening here? Soon, I'd start to understand. In the following days, Lucas continued finding excuses to be near me. If I was in the kitchen, he'd wander in. If I was in the yard, he'd sit nearby. And the compliments kept coming, each one leaving me more uncertain. And, to be honest, I noticed myself doing the same more often, too. "You make this house feel alive," he said one afternoon as I folded laundry. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you, Lucas," I said, finally forcing a smile, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, and not in a way I was comfortable with. The unease I felt grew bigger and bigger. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that Lucas was just being kind, maybe even trying to make up for the distance between us after Barbara's death, but it wasn't just the compliments. It was the way he acted around me, how he always seemed to be there watching me, finding reasons to be close, and I hadn't quite figured out yet why I did the same to him too. One afternoon, I was cooking in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. I heard Lucas come in behind me, his footsteps soft on the tiled floor. I didn't turn around. I was trying to focus on the task at hand, hoping he'd just grab a snack and leave. "Do you need help, Dad?" he asked. I glanced over my shoulder and gave him a quick smile. "Sure, you can slice these carrots," I said, sliding the cutting board toward him. He stepped up beside me, his movements deliberate, and started cutting for a while. We worked in silence. I thought maybe it would just be a quiet, pleasant moment, something normal. But then he stopped cutting and turned to look at me. "You've done so much for me," he said, his voice low. I glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "Mean, after Dad died, you've taken care of everything you didn't have to." "But you did," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. I felt a pang of emotion in my chest. "Of course I did. Lucas, you're my son. I love you," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. He nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. "I just don't think I ever said thank you for all of it." "You don't have to thank me," I said quickly, turning back to the stove. "That's what dads do." He didn't respond, but I could feel him watching me. The moment felt too heavy, too intense, and I wanted nothing more than for it to end. Finally, he picked up the knife and started cutting again, and I let out a small breath of relief after dinner. That night I sat on the couch with a book, hoping to lose myself in the pages. Lucas came into the living room and sat down next to me, not in his usual spot on the other end of the couch, but right next to me. "What are you reading?" he asked, leaning closer to see the cover. "It's just a novel," I said, holding it up for him to see. "Nothing too exciting. Can I read it with you?" He asked the question, caught me off guard. Lucas hadn't shown much interest in reading since he was a kid, and I couldn't remember the last time we'd done something like this together. Part of me wanted to say no, to tell him I needed some time to myself. But another part of me didn't want to push him away. "Sure," I said, scooting over slightly to give him more space. He leaned in close, his shoulder brushing mine as I began to read aloud. At first it felt like any other moment we might have shared years ago, before everything got so complicated. But as the minutes passed, I became increasingly aware of how close he was, how intently he was watching me. Not the book. When I finished the chapter, I closed the book and set it down. "That's enough for tonight," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Thanks for reading to me," he said, his tone soft. "You're welcome," I replied, standing up and heading toward my bedroom. "Good night, Lucas." "Good night, Dad," he said. But there was something in his voice, something I couldn't quite place. But the next morning when I came into the kitchen, Lucas was already there. He'd made coffee and set out breakfast, something he hadn't done in years. "Good morning, Dad," he said, his voice cheerful. "I made you some coffee." "Thank you, Lucas," I said, cautiously sitting down at the table. He sat across from me, watching as I took a sip. "You work so hard," he said suddenly. "You deserve to be taken care of, too." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "That's very sweet of you," I said finally, "but you don't have to do all this for me." "I want to," he said firmly. After breakfast, I retreated to the garden, hoping to clear my head. The air was cool, and the scent of blooming flowers surrounded me. I sat on the bench, staring out at the neatly trimmed hedges, trying to make sense of everything. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Lucas walking toward me, his hands in his pockets. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. "Of course," I said. Though part of me wanted to say no, he sat down beside me, leaving a small space between us for a while. We were silent, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and distant bird song. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Finally, I've just had a lot on my mind," I replied, keeping my gaze fixed on the garden. "Is it about me?" he asked, his tone soft but serious. The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. "Why?" Would you think that he shrugged? I don't know. "I just feel like maybe I've done something to upset you." "You haven't upset me," I said quickly. "I've just been tired." He nodded, but didn't say anything else. After a few more minutes, he stood up. "I'll leave you one," he said, his voice quiet. I watched him walk back into the house, a knot of guilt forming in my chest. He hadn't done anything wrong, Haiti. So why did I feel so uneasy? The days that followed felt strange, as though a heavy cloud had settled over the house. I tried to act. Normal cooking meals, tidying up, and going about my usual routine. But I couldn't shake the tension I felt whenever Lucas was nearby. He hadn't done anything overtly wrong, but his presence lingered in a way that felt different. And then, one night, I made a conscious effort to keep some distance after dinner. I retreated to my bedroom earlier than usual, hoping for some quiet time to myself. I curled up with a book, letting the soft glow of the lamp create a small cocoon of warmth. It felt like a rare reprieve from the unsettling dynamic that had begun to develop. I felt tension and an excitement in me when thinking about Lucas, and it was the first time I recognized it. It caught me off guard, as I couldn't accept the fact that Lucas was my own son. But just as I started Torlax, there was a soft knock at the door. Dad Lucas's voice was low, almost hesitant. I hesitated before answering. "Yes, can I come in?" I glanced at the clock. It was late, far past the time Luca usually went to bed. "Is something wrong?" I asked, sitting up slightly. I wanted to talk," he said. I sighed, setting my book aside. "Come in." The door creaked open, and Lucas stepped inside. He looked different somehow. Less like the confident young man he usually portrayed, and more like the boy I used to comfort after nightmares when he was little. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as though unsure of whether to "Come closer, what's on your mind?" I asked, patting the edge of the bed. He sat down, his movements slow and deliberate for armament. He didn't say anything, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then he looked up, his gaze meeting mine. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said finally, "for what I asked my voice. Cautious for making you feel uncomfortable," he said, his tones sincere. "I know I've been acting different lately, and I don't want you to think I'm trying to make things weird between us." I blinked, surprised by his honesty. "Lucas, I started, but he cut me off. I've been feeling a lot of things, and I don't really know how to deal with them," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "but I don't want to hurt you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I couldn't fully grasp. He reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Lucas, it's okay to feel confused sometimes," I said gently, "but you need to remember that I'm your dad, and our relationship has boundaries." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. I gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before pulling my hand away. "Let not worry about any more," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "We'll figure it out together." There was a certain tension and excitement between us that I couldn't quite name. The look in his eyes told me there was more coming, and I gave that same look back to him as well. He nodded again, standing up. "Good night, Dad," he said. Softly before leaving the room, I watched him go, a strange mix of relief and sadness settling over me. He had acknowledged the tension between us, which felt like a step in the right direction, but I couldn't help wondering if things would truly go back to normal. One thing was for sure, to me, and that was that this was not the last time he would do this, and I was right. I was definitely right. As for the next time he would do this, things would end a lot differently. Then the next morning I woke up feeling more exhausted than usual. The conversation with Lucas had kept me awake. For hours, my mind racing with what-ifs and unanswered questions, I got up, went through my morning routine, and tried to shake the lingering unease. Lucas seemed different that day. Quieter, more reserved. He kept to himself, spending most of the day in his room. Part of me wanted to check on him to make sure he was okay, but another part of me felt like I needed to give him space. That evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Lucas came in. He sat down on the couch without saying a word, watching me silently as I worked. The quiet between us felt heavy, and I struggled to think of something to say. "You've been quiet today," I said finally, glancing at him. He shrugged, just thinking about anything in particular. I asked, trying to sound casual. "About us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He froze for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine. I know things have been weird lately, and I don't want it to be like that anymore," he said. I nodded, slowly, unsure of how to respond. "I don't want that either," I said finally, "but we need to figure out how to move forward." He nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "We will," he said. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things would get better. Maybe we could move past this and find a way to rebuild our relationship. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something. I didn't fully understand, or maybe I did understand it, but I did not want to accept it. Yet. The quiet unease that had settled over the house didn't go away. Lucas tried to act normal, but I could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he hesitated before speaking, or lingered too long when we crossed paths. I wanted to believe his apology barbered the end of everything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. Simple. And then one evening, as I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone in an attempt to unwind it, happened. Again. It was late, and the house was silent except for the soft creak of the ceiling fan. Above me, I had just begun to drift off when I heard a faint knock at my bedroom door. Dad Lucas's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I sat up, my heart sinking. "Yes, can I come in?" he asked. I glanced at the CL. "It was well past midnight, Lucas. It's late," I said, trying to keep my tone firm. "What's wrong?" There was a pause before he replied. "I just need to talk to you something." And his voice made me hesitate. I took a deep breath, then said, "Okay, come in." The door creaked open, and Lucas stepped inside. He looked unsure of himself, his hands shoved into his pockets as he lingered near the doorway. "What is it?" "Lucas," yesed, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, his gaze flickering. Between me and the floor, I've been thinking a lot about what I said. "The other night," he began, his voice low, "and I feel like I need to be honest with you." My chest tightened. Honest about what? I asked carefully. He stepped closer, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "About how I feel," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know it's wrong, and I've tried to ignore it, but I can't stop thinking about you, Dad." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, my mind racing. "Lucas, you can't." I started, but he cut me off. "I know," he said quickly, his voice full of desperation. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. You've been everything to me since Dad died. You're kind and strong, and you've done so much for me. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." His words hit me like a physical blow. I felt frozen, unable to move or speak as his confession hung in the air. "Lucas, you're my son," I said, Finally, my voice shaking. "I love you, but not like that. This has to stop." "I know," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. I needed to tell you." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Lucas, what you're feeling is a result of everything we've been through. It's not real. You're young and you're confused. But this isn't right. We need to work through this. Together." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," he said, softly. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know," I said, my heart breaking at the sight of him, "but we can't let this continue. You're a good person, Lucas, and you'll move past this." He wiped his eyes, standing up slowly. "Good night." "Daddy," said, his voice barely audible. "Good night," I replied, watching as he left the room and closed the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and sat down on the bed, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I felt overwhelmed with guilt and confusion, questioning everything I had done that might have led to this moment. I loved Lucas with all my heart, but his feelings were something I couldn't ignore or dismiss that night. I barely slept. I kept replaying his words in my head, trying to make sense of them. I told myself it was just a phase, a moment of confusion that would pass, but deep down, I wasn't sure. The next morning, Lucas was quiet. He barely said a word at breakfast, and when he left for school, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I spent the day trying to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to our conversation. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. When Lucas came home that evening, he seemed distant, avoiding eye contact and retreating to his room. Almost immediately I wanted to talk to him to make sure he was okay, but I didn't know where to start. I felt trapped, unsure of how to handle the situation without making things worse. Later that night, I was sitting in the living room staring at the TV without really watching it. The house was quiet, and I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me suddenly. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Lucas standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. Of course, he walked over and sat down on the couch, leaving a small space between us. For a while, we sat in silence, the tension between us almost unbearable. "Daddy," said. Finally, his voice soft. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said quickly, "but we need to set boundaries. Lucas, for both of us." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I understand." I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "We'll get through this," I said gently. "But you have to trust me." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with emotion. "I do," he said. I gave him a small smile, hoping to reassure him. "Then we'll be okay." As I sat there, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could move past this, but deep down, I knew it would take time. The days after our conversation were tense but quiet. Lucas kept his distance, and I tried to act as though everything was normal. But the truth weighed heavily on me. I hope that acknowledging the situation and setting boundaries would help us both move forward. Yet something deep inside told me the silence between us wasn't enough to fix what had been broken then. One final night, I went to bed early, exhausted from a day spent trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. The house was quiet, and the cool night air wafted gently through my open window. It tried to let the rhythmic hum of the fan lull me to sleep, but my mind wouldn't settle. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was being pulled from sleep by the sound of my door creaking open. My heart jumped as I blinked in the darkness, trying to orient myself. Dad Lucas's voice was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. I sat up, reaching for the bedside lamp. The warm glow filled the room, illuminating Lucas standing hesitantly in the doorway. He looked unsure, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Lucas," I said. my voice thick with sleep and confusion. "What are you doing?" He stepped into the room, his movement slow and deliberate. I couldn't sleep," he said, quietly. I needed to see you." My chest tightened as I tried to steady my breathing. "It's late," I said, my voice firmer. "Now you need to go back to bed." "You know," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, but I couldn't stop thinking about everything. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, sitting upright. "Lucas, I was thinking about you too, but we talked about this," I said gently. "I love you, but it's not something we can talk about anymore." He took another step. Forward, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel," he said, his voice trembling. "You're the only one who's ever really been there. For me, you've always cared about me in a way. No one else has." My throat felt tight as I tried to find the right words. "Lucas, I care about you because I'm your dad," I said firmly. "That's my job, but the way you're feeling, it's not healthy, it's not right." He stood there for a moment, his shoulders slumping as the weight of my words settled over him. "I'm sorry," he said, softly, tears glistening in his eyes. I just didn't know how else to tell you. My heart broke at the sight of him, but I forced myself to remain calm. "It's okay to feel confused, Lucas," I said, "but this is something you need to work through, and I'll help you as your dad, but only as your dad." The words didn't feel right, as I definitely wanted something else, and I could see the disappointment in his eyes, which made me regret my choice. He nodded, slowly, his gaze is dropping to the floor. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice barely audible. "You won't," I assured him, "but we have to move forward, Lucas, for both of us." And when I said those words, something in me shifted. All of a sudden, I asked myself, what am I doing? Why can't I just help my son with whatever he wants? He's my son. It hurted me to see how my words disappointed him, and I did not want it anymore. And besides, I like the idea of what he wanted as well. Somehow, maybe because I missed Barbara a lot as well. And so, after a second of silence, I said, "You know what? Come here," as I invited him to sit beside me. He moved towards me, and I could see him opening up again. "Look me in the eyes," I said while I leaned in towards him. He leaned in towards me as well, and then it happened. We kissed each other. It was as if a bomb of tension exploded. There, it was so good that Imadi sure the kiss deepened, and after a minute or two, he reached back and stopped kissing. It wasn't because he was in doubt or something. No, it was because he started grabbing me in places only Barbara had grabbed me before, and as you can probably tell, we went even further than that. I hope understand why I told you this was the craziest but yet most exciting night of my life. It was amazing. After we both had finished, there was a long silence. "Are you okay?" he said. "Yes, don't worry," I replied. For a long moment, I think 10 to 20 minutes. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fan. Then Lucas turned and walked toward the door. He paused in the doorway, glancing back at me. "Good night, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Good night, Lucas," I replied, my heart aching as I watched him leave. "Thank you for everything I have to thank you, Dad," he said. When the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a shaky breath, the tension in my chest finally easing. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling as the events of the past few weeks replayed in my mind. I knew Westall had a long road ahead, but for the first time, I felt as a sliver of hope that we could find our way back to a healthier relationship. Finally, the tension had snapped, and the next morning, Lucas was quiet but composed. He joined me for breakfast, and while the conversation was light, I could sense a shift. In his demeanor, he seemed more at ease, as though he had finally let go of some of the weight he'd been carrying over. The next few weeks, things began to feel more normal. Lucas started spending more time with friends, and his focus shifted back to school and his plans for the future. We didn't talk about what had happened again, but the unspoken understanding between us was clear. We were both trying to move on as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. One evening, Lucas turned to me and said, "Thanks for being patient with me. Dad, thank you for everything you do for and with me. Thanks for accepting me for who I am, and helping me on every aspect, even on aspects where dads usually don't help." Their son with, I looked at him surprised, but touched by his words. I lay my hand on his arm. "Of course," I said, "that's what dads do." He smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it felt genuine. In that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. I'm still not sure about what I did since it happened. Oh, this happened a couple times more even, and besides that, I enjoy it myself. As well, I know I help Lucas a lot. Maybe it's just because we both want to make up for the loss of Barbara, or maybe it's something else. I don't know. I needed to tell the story to someone to get to know other people's opinions. Should I stop doing this with Lucor? Is it maybe even more normal then? What are your thoughts on it? Please tell me in the comments. It would help me a lot. Thank you.